thesis writing and motivation, and the theme of this video is afraid to do it. Here's a quote from a student at our recent webinar for graduate students, which we call the Writing Cafe. I feel guilty a lot. I feel need to write now, but at the same time, it's not easy to sit and write. So when we look at motivation and the lack of motivation and procrastinating behavior, there are 4 reasons why we get up from our writing seat and go and do something else. So in the other 2 videos, don't want to do it, too distracted to do it, we talked about a lack of motivation and being pulled away from writing. In this video, we're going to look at afraid to do it. And then in the next video, don't know how to do it. So what is afraid to do it about? This is really about working in a critical discourse, in a critical environment, and it's about writing anxiety, which many people have, and it's about self-criticism, that internal critical voice that can sometimes be so loud. So working in a critical discourse, we work in an environment that is built on critique, feedback, and criticism. And when you think about it, supervisors, examiners, reviewers, that's their job. It's their job to critique writing. If an examiner had to see a thesis that was absolutely perfect, that examiner would still have to come up with something to say about it. So critique and feedback is part of this environment. It's very rare that you would ever get totally positive feedback or no feedback at all. That's the job of everyone in this environment. I just want to focus on the terms that we use here and to think about the difference between them. So critique, what we're talking about here is a kind of academic judgment based on criteria and reasoning. So this would be an informed, educated critique. Feedback would be suggestions for improvements, comments, suggestions for changing things, but feedback for improvement. Criticism, on the other hand, really is about disapproval. It's about focusing on mistakes and a person's fault. It's much more personal than either critique or feedback. So I want you to think about these in slightly different ways. And really what we want on our writing is critique and feedback, but not criticism, because we often can't do anything with criticism. And I think it's quite useful to recognize that difference. So when we procrastinate, we're often protecting ourselves from criticism. So the fault finding, where we feel like we are under attack. So when we procrastinate, we're protecting ourselves from what we perceive, the negative kind of feedback that we think we're going to receive through criticism. And within academic writing, and particularly amongst thesis writers, there's one type of procrastinator, the perfectionist, who people become perfectionists because they really want to ensure that there will be no criticism whatsoever. So they want to write a perfect paper to ensure that there will be no criticism on this paper, and they won't experience that negative feedback. And procrastination itself is about trying to take control of the situation. So sometimes what we do is we leave things to the last minute and we undermine our chances of success, because then at least we're in control. So we can say, I didn't put in the effort, I waited until the last minute. If I'd worked earlier, I would have been able to do a better job. But at least when you get the negative feedback, you can say to yourself, well, I knew that was going to happen. So in a very strange way, procrastination is about protecting ourselves from experiencing these negative emotions, and we disable ourselves often or sometimes we disable ourselves from achieving success because then we are still in control of the process. But the difficulty with this, particularly, lots of students will say to me, oh, well, I work very well if I leave it for the last minute and then I write quickly. The difficulty with this is that even though we do achieve some success, we feel guilty about the process and ashamed. So even though we know we did things at the last minute, we could have done them better, we still feel the sense of guilt and shame that goes with it. So even though we feel like we're taking some control, really we aren't. And a much better way of taking control would be to understand the difference between feedback and criticism, and then decide what you're going to do with that criticism. So there are different kinds of criticism. There's external criticism, where somebody outside of you gives you criticism. And then there's self-criticism. And self-criticism is made up of all the people who have criticized your writing. I'm talking about writing in particular here. All the people who have criticized your writing over time. But it's also made up of all the people you think might criticize your writing. So it's not a real voice or a rational voice by any means. So you might feel that for example, my PhD supervisor wrote really well. Well, he wrote beautifully, and I always felt like my writing never measured up to his. So then I would criticize myself for not producing writing like his. So it's not a voice that is rational. It contains all our fears and our imagined fears. There's also actual criticism and anticipated criticism. Actual criticism is where we've actually received that criticism, and anticipated is where it's what we think we're going to get, which can sometimes be worse. And then there's fair and unfair criticism. Fair criticism is where you agree with the criticism, and unfair is where you don't. Now, it doesn't really matter if it's fair or unfair, because even fair criticism can be really hurtful. But basically, all these kinds of criticisms, whether it's self or anticipated or fair criticism, they feed into our internal voice, and they can be, particularly for writing, they can have devastating effects because they are so hurtful. And what it does is it prevents us from writing. It prevents us from taking risks with writing, because we don't want to have that outcome of, that negative outcome at the end of the day. So what I'm really trying to say here is that we need to understand the role that criticism plays in the environment that we work in. That some people provide us with critique, some people provide us with feedback, but other people provide us with criticism, which is sometimes quite unhelpful. So we need to understand all of these things, whether it's critique, feedback, or criticism, so that we can control our reaction to that. And it really matters that we do respond to whether it is criticism, feedback, or critique, because if we avoid criticism, then so what happens is sometimes, if we are trying to prevent any criticism, we won't do things that we want to do, so that we just won't get that criticism. So, for example, what often happens in academic circles is that people who get a really bad peer review will often not publish either that paper or publish again. So even though they want to publish, a harsh peer review can be so devastating that it derails those goals. You sideline those goals because you don't want to go through that experience again. So it's very important that we make a decision to deal with criticism. So, where you say to yourself, okay, I'm going to look at this criticism and I'm going to decide whether or not there's anything useful in this. And whatever I don't think is useful, I'm going to let go. If we don't do that, then we subconsciously internalize that criticism. and it becomes part of our internal voice. So we want to make a decision about what becomes part of that internal voice. So related to working in a critical environment is writing anxiety. This is one of the most common things that graduate students experience is writing anxiety. We're always taught as researchers that we need to be objective. And we tend to think that because we're objective in terms of approaching research, that writing is also objective. When in fact, writing is so tied into our emotions and our perceptions of self-esteem and intellect. And that's why when somebody criticizes our writing, and here I'm talking about criticism, we feel they are criticizing who we are as a person. So they're criticizing us, the very essence of who we are, and definitely our intellect. And that's why it can be so devastating, because we feel like it's not about the writing, it's about us. Now, if you get feedback or critique, you can see more easily that that's about the writing. When you get criticism, if somebody says, "Oh, I love this section," or "I hate this section," which is there's nothing you can do with that kind of response. That's more likely to feed into that critical self voice of yours than someone who says, "I can't identify your problem. I can't identify your research problem," which is something that you can then go and fix. But there's no criticism involved in that about you as a person. So this is the danger of criticism and of working in an environment where we are exposed to criticism, is that it feeds into our critical voice and it feeds into our writing anxieties. So writing anxiety is really common in academic circles, and the anxiety can be around a number of things. It can be around ourselves as writers. It can be around the writing situation, where you are writing. And it can be around the writing task. So you might find, working on one chapter, for example, the literature review, can provoke huge anxiety, whereas the methodology doesn't evoke as much anxiety. And that's because in the literature review, the risks are higher because you're making comments on the state of the discipline. Or you could be making comments on the state of the discipline. I don't want you all to get anxious now that you're not doing that. So the more negative one feels about writing, the more one avoids it. And if we don't understand the role criticism plays and how it feeds into writing anxiety, then we won't understand why we're avoiding writing. The other thing to realize is that emotions may surface at different points in the writing process. And this is something I see often, is that a student who has done really well as an undergraduate or has won an award as a master's student for a paper published suddenly finds themselves not being able to write at all. And that's because the expectations, so that person's expectations of themselves and their perceptions of other people's expectations have gone out of control, and they feel like they can never match that. So that's that internal critical voice now saying, this is not good enough, this is not good enough, even though that person has done really well. So success can feed into that internal critical voice as well. So at different points in the writing process, at the beginning, you may feel very anxious about a project, but as you become more familiar with it, you do more reading on it, you begin to develop confidence, you may present it a couple of times and defend it, and then begin to feel really confident about it towards the end of the process. So in the beginning, you need to nurture yourself, nurture your ideas. Towards the end, you can defend it quite, as I can't remember who said it, but, your enemies can attack your thesis at that point, but you would still be able to defend it because you're confident about it then. Okay, so just to go over this one more time, this critical environment and the criticism we often receive linked with anxiety, and writing in a context that is prone to writing anxiety results in this internal critical voice that can get overdeveloped, and it can control the way we write. So self-criticism can be crippling when it comes to writing. This is the thing that tells us to stop. That internal editor, that internal critical voice is constantly saying, don't write that, don't write that. If you write that, someone will see that you shouldn't be here. If you write that, everyone will know that you don't deserve to have got a master's or be in the PhD program or whatever it is that internal voice tells you. So criticism, anxiety, and self-criticism affect what we believe about writing. It affects our beliefs about writing and whether or not we feel like we can do this. So over the years, if you have experienced enough failure or negative comments on your writing, it can feed into a belief that you can't do this. And I mean, this is something that doesn't only happen with writing. It's something that happens with mathematics as well, and I'm sure there are lots of other topics. But it's common amongst writers. So if you have received repeated negative feedback on your writing, you might have developed a belief that you are not a writer. And this is a learned belief, and it's a fixed mindset. If you experience successes, then what happens is that even though you are failing now, you feel like you're failing now, you will say to yourself, but in the past I was able to overcome this, so I'll find a way to overcome it now. If you experience negative feedback or failures, perceived failures, then when you hit a roadblock, you'll say, oh, I can't do this because I'm not a writer, and you won't persevere through it. So writing beliefs are really important because they can stop you or they can help you persevere. And the most important thing to learn from this is that these are learned beliefs. So then you just need to unlearn that belief and become much more flexible in your mindset. So perseverance is all about your belief in your ability to write this thesis, or at least find a way to write it. So if you believe you can do it, you will find a way to persevere. If you believe you can't do it, you will get up and you'll find something else to do. So it's your belief in your ability to write is really important in terms of perseverance. And again, this is a learned belief, so you can change it. Okay, so if you are afraid to write, and this is what this video is about, so this is about sitting down to write and then feeling anxious and then getting up and going to do something else. Now, when you get up to go and do something else, that really is a good strategy because you are protecting yourself from further negative experiences. You're trying to control the outcome. So what I'm saying here is that don't beat yourself up for procrastinating or getting up and going to do something else. Rather, think about how you can change this. How can you change it so that you'll stay in your chair and you'll work through it and you'll persevere? So if you don't think that you can write this thesis, you will find ways to distract yourself and you'll give up when things get tough. So the strategies for staying in your chair when you feel that sense of anxiety and you want to go and do something else is definitely to separate the writing from editing. So you want to have a writing space where you keep that critical voice quiet and you allow yourself just to write and to write badly and not to fix it up at that point. Try and write for a friendly audience. So I like to use Granny because in my mind Granny is kind and gentle but quite straightforward. But if Granny doesn't work for you, find somebody who doesn't threaten you in any way so that when you write you feel you can write without anxiety. Think about when you look for feedback. So once you've written a draft, if you still feel very anxious about that draft, then don't, or give it to somebody who's going to be gentle and kind first before you give it to your supervisor who's going to pull it apart. Now, there's a caveat to this because I don't want you to hold on to your draft forever. But what I'm saying is that this is about the beginning process of your writing when you still feel unsure and new about your ideas. So rather than give it to someone who's going to critique it harshly, give it to somebody who can help you get it to a point where you can get that, where you feel more confident about it, and then you can withstand the harsher criticism. So that you're protecting yourself when your ideas are new and your writing is new until you can get to a point where you feel confident about what you've done. Understand that critical feedback can be helpful. So getting feedback and getting critique can be really helpful. Not can be, it will be. Because your supervisor, for example, has supervised other students. They know what examiners will be looking for. They know what peer reviewers will be looking for. And they are giving you pointers to help get you to that point where you succeed. So critical feedback, critique and feedback is helpful. But criticism that says things like this is sloppy, this is things that attack you as a person, that's not helpful. And the way you can tell them apart is to say, can I do something with this? So if you can do something with that comment, then you can decide, do I want to do something with it? And then you can go with that. But if somebody says you're writing sloppy, what can you do with that? Now, what you can do is go back to the person and say, show me how it's sloppy. How would I make this sentence less sloppy? Then you can do something with it. Rather than taking the critique on board and saying, I'm sloppy. So the whole point of this is to make that decision, is to say, I'm not taking that on board. So you take the critique, things you can do with your writing, and you leave the criticism. So what to do about writing anxiety? The first thing I would do is to actually write about it. So if you sit down to write and you immediately feel like I don't want to be here, all your emotions are on the rise, then write about why you are feeling so anxious and begin with I feel. And you can write about a specific piece. So if you were due to write a section of a paper, then write why are you anxious about this particular piece of writing. Or you can write more generally, why am I anxious about writing? And you might find you have to do this before you start every single session until you get to a point where you feel more comfortable to sit down and write. Some people have had terrible experiences with writing and some really horrible feedback that they shouldn't have had to experience. So you might need to work your way through this. And then, as I've mentioned, and I won't go through it again, recognizing the different stages of the writing journey. And you might feel more insecure and more anxious at the beginning, but as you develop more confidence, you feel better about things. Self-criticism, you really have to watch self-criticism. This is the number one thing that stops us from writing. Watch tiredness, because we tend to be more self-critical when we're tired. So rather edit in the morning and free write when you're tired. Because with free writing, you're not criticizing yourself at all and you're not criticizing your writing. And then the next morning when you're feeling fresh, that's when you edit. And you might even then begin to say, actually, this is not too bad. But if you edit at night when you're tired, you're going to scrap the whole thing. Externalize your critical voice with an object. I'm going to explain that a little bit more in the next slide. Try and build your self-belief in writing. So one of the things you need to remember is that you're doing an advanced degree. You must have done well, in the years leading up to this to get to this point. So focus on your successes and focus on things that you've done well, and even list them if you have to in writing. List the things that you've done well related to writing, right? And then when you start hearing that critical voice, go back and look at that list again. And part of looking at your successes and noting when you got through bad times and you were able to persevere and you finished a paper when you didn't think you were going to be able to, and you did well in a paper when you thought it was going to be terrible, part of the reason for noting those successes is to change your self-belief about writing. I always get my students to write an assignment when they first come into my classes about their writing histories. They have to write about memorable events. So things where they've received negative feedback, or times when they've received negative feedback, and times when they've had successes. And this is really to get them to reflect on their writing beliefs. You know, the thing is, I'm the kind of writer who, I'm the kind of writer who doesn't do well, or I'm not the kind of writer who writes naturally. Those kinds of statements are the ones that we need to change. Okay, so externalizing your critical voice, what I would suggest is you find a little gimmicky toy like one of these, and you put it at your, and so this little toy will represent your critical voice. You put it near your computer somewhere, and when it starts speaking in your ear, you just say, no, keep quiet until I'm finished this piece of writing, and then you can come in later. Now, you don't have to tell anybody this. You don't have to say it out loud. You can just do it quietly to yourself. You can say, keep quiet. But it's really just to externalize that critical voice so that you can keep it quiet while you're generating writing. And you can see from the little gizmos that I have here on my computer that they are fun things, because you don't want to beat yourself up about your critical voice. You don't want to say, I have the worst critical voice ever. You want to be kind to yourself and just say, okay, critical voice, you're doing a good job of protecting me, but at this point in time, I need to get writing done, so you have to keep quiet. So moving forward, acknowledge the critical environment that we're working in, and acknowledge the emotional side of writing and how much it can derail us. So notice how much it stops you from writing. If you notice it, then you can do something about it, and then develop strategies to keep moving forward. I know we've covered a lot in this video, and I do have other videos on YouTube on this topic. I have quite a few videos on procrastination, on dealing with criticism, on writing fluency. So have a look at those if you want to see more on this. But otherwise, I hope that you're able to keep that critical voice quiet, at least for a while when you're generating writing. And I wish you the best of luck for the writing you have to do. Thanks for watching. Bye.